Our last class in botany was fungi. But then, before we go into today's topic, which is Bryophyta, let's quickly take a recap of what we've done so far. So we said that botany is the study of plants, and we said that plants belongs to the kingdom Plantae. And we said this kingdom Plantae is subdivided into two, into non-flowering and seedless plants, called the cryptograms, or what you refer to as the lower plants. And we said they are also subdivided into the phanerograms. So which means, in brief, we have the cryptograms and the phanerograms. But then we said that the cryptograms possess no seeds, while the phanerogram are plants possessing seeds. But still, both are falling under the kingdom Plantae. Then focusing on the cryptograms, we said that the cryptograms are subdivided into those ones that possess vascular bundles. In other words, they possess xylem and phloem, and those ones that do not possess it. So for those that possess vascular bundles, we have the pteridophytes. And those that do not possess the vascular bundles are subdivided into two. And don't forget, whenever I say that they do not possess vascular bundles, it means that they do not possess xylem and the phloem tissue. So we classified the non-vascular into Talophyta and Bryophyta. And we said that the Talophyta includes the fungi. But we said also that fungi is not supposed to be classified under the kingdom Plantae. Why? Because fungi is a kingdom on its own. But the reason fungi was placed here is because fungi is also made up of thallus, from the word Talophyta. So fungi is also made up of thallus. And so because fungi is made up of thallus, it can be classified just like we have bacteria made up of thallus. And we will say when we say something is made up of thallus, it means that the body parts, okay, cannot be differentiated into root, it cannot be differentiated into stem, and it cannot be differentiated into leaves. So the same thing applicable to fungi, and that's why fungi is falling there. So algae too do not possess root, stem, and leaf, hence they are thallus. Then the second classification is actually the Bryophyta. And we said that the Bryophyta also belongs to the non-vascular, non-flowering plants, which means that they do not possess xylem and they do not possess phloem. But then, what differentiates Talophytas from Bryophyta, or the Bryophytes from the Talophytes? One of the things that differentiates the Bryophyte from the Talophytes is that for the Bryophyte, they possess an organ, okay, for probably sexual reproduction. But for these ones, okay, they do not possess, or they don't have any developed organ. Okay. Another reason is that these ones undergo, that's the Bryophyte, can undergo an alternation of generation. In other words, they can choose to undergo sexual and asexual. But in the better way, we call it gametophytic and sporophytic generation. So they undergo alternation of generation. But then we are not putting all the points here, okay, on the first page that differentiates Bryophyta from the Talophyta. All right. But what we are taking from here is that number one, the Bryophytes, one, they belong to the non-flowering or the seedless plants, or what you call the lower plants. And when we say lower plants, it means that they are small, okay, or what we call primitive. Another thing we can pick out there is that they belong to the non-vascular, which means that they are non-vascular. So they do not possess vascular bundles. The implication of that is that they would have no xylem, okay, and no phloem. And plants that do not possess xylem and phloem, what happens to them? They try to survive for water and food because they don't have these two tissues. And of which we know that xylem is a tissue that conducts water in plants, and phloem conducts food. Which means that if a plant do not possess these two guys, the plant would end up trying to survive different conditions. Okay, and bryophytes fall in this class. Another thing we are picking out from this is that they belong to the kingdom Plantae. See the way I picked the definition. So if I am asked to define bryophyte, I'll just say bryophytes are cryptograms, or they are small or primitive plants that lacks vascular bundles. And so because they lack these vascular bundles, they struggle to survive with the environmental conditions like feeding and the likes of it. And then I can end saying that they belong to the plant kingdom. Then I give examples. With that, I have defined what bryophytes or bryophyta means. But then don't forget that the study of bryophytes is actually called bryology. So when I say what is bryology, is the study of the plants called bryophyte. Now let's go into the bryophyta and see how far we can go with it. So we have the division bryophyta. The study of bryophytes is actually referred to as bryology, as I've said earlier. And then we said that bryophyta or bryophytes are microscopic, small microscopic. Okay, so when you say microscopic, it still means small. All right, terrestrial green plants, which means that they can photosynthesize. That's what it means. That lives on land, okay, and also struggle for survival, right, with life due to their lack of vascular bundles. So this definition just happened to be a modified one, but it's more like what we said earlier. We said that bryophytes are small. Okay, this is one of the keywords I used earlier. Then the next thing I told you about is that they struggle to survive. Okay, so this is your keyword here. And the last thing is that they lack vascular bundles. So this statement, struggle to survive, is actually dependent on the fact that they lack those vascular bundles. And the vascular bundles are the xylem and the phloem tissues. Okay. So whenever I ask you, or whenever you're asked to define bryophytes, bryophytes are small, microscopic, terrestrial plants, which means that they live on land. And so they survive with life due to the lack of vascular bundles, which happen to be the xylem and the phloem tissues. So we have the general characteristics of the bryophytes, and the general characteristics is actually compressed into the acronym SAND. All right, so the SAND is not SAND. Take note of that. There's an R here. For the first one, we have S. S is telling us that they are small. Okay, that's the keyword there. The A is telling us that they have alternation of generation. And we'll talk about alternation of generation. Alternation of generation is subdivided into two. So alternation of generation is actually divided into two. The first is gametophytic generation, and the second is sporophytic generation. So what do we mean by gametophytic generation? Gametophytic generation is all about the plant being inclined towards the production of gametes. What are those gametes? The male gamete and the female gamete. What you call, in human, you call it sperm and the egg cell. But in plants, what we call it is antherozoid. Now, where is this gamete produced from? It's actually produced from an organ called antheridia. So I have mentioned two things here. The first thing I mentioned is that I mentioned the male gametes, okay? And the next thing I mentioned is actually the organ where the male gamete is produced from. All right, just like we have the penis and the sperm. That's how it is too. But they do not only produce the male gametes, okay? They can also produce the female gametes. And what's the female gamete called? It's called archegonia. Archegonia, don't forget. And the archegonia give rise to a portion, or give rise to a gamete called the ovum. Another name we'll call the ovum is called the oosphere. The oosphere. Okay, oosphere. And so this is the summary of what we have as far as gametophytic generation is concerned. All right. So we have something we also call sporophytic generation. When we talk about sporophytic generation, we're actually talking about the ability of the plant to make spores. So for bryophytes, what is really dominant, which means that the first generation or the first life cycle they tend to undergo is actually the gametophytic generation. And so we say that that gametophytic generation is their main life cycle, or better still, we say is their first life cycle. So that first life cycle is dominant in every bryophyte you see, whether Riccia, whether Machentia, or Funaria. All of them possess that gametophytic generation as their main or dominant generation. Now, this gametophytic generation, when the gamete produced from the female organ fuses with that of the gamete in the male organ, they eventually generate a child, and that child is a child in womb called the zygote. But in the real sense, we don't call it the zygote sometimes. What we call that zygote is actually
Uspo.
so in brief, the gametophytic generation give rise to sporophytic generation. So this is just characteristics. I will still explain the whole of this one after the other. So the next thing we have understand, which is one of the characteristics of bryophytes. R means reproduction, and this reproduction can be sexual or the reproduction is asexual. So it means that reproduction is subdivided into two. They can undergo sexual reproduction, okay, and they can also undergo asexual reproduction. Now, what yield the sexual reproduction? Gametophytic generation yield the sexual reproduction because they produce gametes, and those gametes will have to fuse together. And when they fuse together, they give rise to the zygote. When zygote is produced in the long run, that eventually yield the asexual reproduction or yield the sporophytic generation, which is asexual reproduction. I'll be explaining that too. So the next one is N. N, we are supporting it with O, which is no. All right. So what are those things that are absent there? Number one, they do not possess a root system. And we've said that before because they belong to the cryptograms, and cryptograms are seedless and flowering. Not just because of that, they also belong to the non-vascular ones. Another thing they do not possess is actually the vascular bundles. All right. So, and when we say they do not possess vascular bundles, it means that we are saying that they do not have phloem and xylem tissue. Okay, I think we've mentioned that before. And the last thing is that they are usually found in damp areas. Sometimes we add the word shady, which means that they are not only found in damp areas, they are also found where there is shade, which means that they probably prioritizes a cold environment or a cool environment. Not because that place is just wet, but because that place is also shady. And lastly, we have examples, right? An example, we have Riccia, we have Machantia, and we have Funaria.